Well, obviously all our speakers have really warmed to their subjects because we've gone probably a little bit over in terms of what we anticipated in the speaker time. But one thing that I'm absolutely certain about is that none of you have come here just to have wine and canapes and things like that. So if we truncate a little bit of time there and have a little bit longer for questions and discussion, I'm sure that that'll find favour with everybody here. So, the important thing about events like this isn't just having illustrious and knowledgeable speakers, it's actually having a proper debate and proper discussion, and this is the opportunity where we actually get questions, you make observations and comments from the floor. So can I throw it open to the floor now to make comments on the presentations that we've had, please? And if you could just explain who you are and what your interest is, I think that would be helpful at the beginning of the question. Thank you. Who's going to be first? There's an arm straight up there. Hello. Wow. Well-known face as well, Perry.
Question for Sir David. My name's Perry Six. I'm from Normington University. When I asked a civil servant from your department a couple of years ago why at that time the government's proposal for the identity card was that when a card was presented, in most circumstances, access to the full record would be released when the agency receiving the card actually made the online contact with the National Register. The answer I was given was that the cost of producing a ground need-to-know base kind of matrix of all the categories of information for particular services was disproportionate. This struck me slightly odd because, of course, in the National Health Service, as part of the role-based access programme, we are spending squillions on doing exactly that. And given that Stefan Brands has argued that technologically the difficulties are not that great, I wonder whether you want to say something about whether the organisation or the cost issues are still the barrier to having much more finely grained disclosures from the National Register at the point of presentation of the card to each particular agency in order to get closer to the need-to-know principle.
Well, I think it is possible to have differential disclosure, and that is a possibility. There are cost issues, but I think it is possible to do that, and it actually rather depends. In the plan that we published, we look at different levels of presentation of the identifier. In other words, it doesn't have to be the full thing. I mean, it would be ridiculous to take a fingerprint to get into a club, for instance. So there are different levels of access that you could get according to what the usage is. And I think we are prepared to consider that. Of course, it depends who you think is paying for this. It doesn't all have to be the taxpayer. It can be the individual, it can be the business that is using it, and there will be quite a welter of regulation around this which will limit how it can be used as well. So I don't know what my colleague said 2 years ago, but I think probably thinking has moved on a bit.
Okay, John Harrison.
John Harrison from Credentica. A question for the panel, if I may.
To you next.
The topic for today was identity management and personal information management over the internet. And it strikes me that there is a different problem on the internet compared to the same issues in the real world. And if I give an example, so David, you have a particular identifier, an identity card by which you're known to the Home Office. You also presumably have a computer log-on at the Home Office. I think you'll be surprised if, when you're paying to the Oxford Internet Institute, perhaps if you were a guest here, that your Home Office log-on would work at the Oxford Internet Institute. But they're both identities. So the point is, I think, that there are many identities. There are inevitably going to be many identities in the network world, whereas perhaps in the physical world we have just one. Going a bit further, if you accept that point, how do you imagine that the identity card identity is going to be used for many different purposes in the network world, or is it just going to be used for, effectively, the identities to central government? Electronically, or in the networks?
Well, we were talking about this before. I think one of the problems is that we don't know the answer to that question. It could be potentially used for lots of different purposes, but actually there are so many different purposes that we need to decide what it's to be used for. And personally, I think we will have to try to narrow down initially what it is used for to the things that government and Parliament decides are priority issues. We have decided to use it with the passport. It would be possible to develop it with the internet. It's not very complicated to do that. You can stick the card in the machine. We can do that. There are various things. You can put your fingerprint, you can have your fingerprint recognised. I think those choices have to be made as to how far we want to both use that and also, again, who's prepared to pay for it. But effectively, we're developing this on the back of the passport first, and it will then have some other uses. How widely that is used, I think, is a choice. And it's partly a choice for the consumer and the citizen, really, as to whether they want to use it like that, whether they would find it useful. So I think that's all to play for. We are a long way from having anything that is usable, but it could be used in connection with the internet.
Do you appreciate the privacy issues with the suggestion that you could be used to could be asked to use a single identifier for multiple different purposes electronically?
Yes, I do appreciate those, but my privacy is under attack every single day. I mean, this isn't a sort of a greenfield site here, is it? People know a huge amount about me. It's possible to track my journey here. It's possible to know everything I've done today. So, I mean, in a sense, we are balancing some things. It's possible, isn't it, that with a national scheme, it's possible that it could be more secure than what we have now, because you can regulate it and you can also control its uses. A lot of what happens to us, we're unable to control. It's out of our control, effectively.
I bit of a comment by a certain politician saying there was such a thing, society, that wasn't the same thing as government. And that phrase keeps coming back to my mind in this debate. Somehow, it's not the identity card, it has to be an identity card with central government, which I support. I just dislike the notion that it's going to be used for government.
And I think those are the choices we can make, really. But supposing we did nothing, then this would still develop. National identity schemes of various schemes would develop, are developing, wouldn't they?
Well, I'm a bit worried about this developing into a binary discussion.
Yes, sorry.
Could I add something?
Yeah, you can.
You mentioned the online piece, which I think is interesting because it, in a sense, that's ungoverned territory, either by government or any other governance structure. So the fact that I leave digital trails of various sorts around the place, do I get concerned if there is anyone capable of linking up those trails through the fact that there are features in those trails which look as if they are identical, like a credit card number or an address or a phone number or a name or whatever? Yes, you do, because I've not given consent for those joins to be made, and yet there's nothing I can do to stop it. So that I think is part of the argument that people say your online privacy is dead. Get over it, because it is there. Some of you may have tripped across a service which I know quite a lot about, and this isn't a plug except go and have a look, called Garlic, Garlik. And it's actually a harvesting service for information about you. It trawls some 30 billion web pages and finds out anything that looks as if it purports to you. And you'd be gobsmacked to find just how much there is known that looks as if it is about you. Some of it isn't, but some of it is. And I get a regular monthly update on anything that is known about me. And so far, I've not been seriously scared. I've been a little bit worried, but not seriously scared. And given the jobs that I do, and we all do perhaps, you will sort of... Now that is a service that's being offered by some people I know and trust. But are there other services out there using exactly the same open source technology, doing things which are identical and using that information for other purposes? My guess is yes. And that's the piece of concern that I have, which is the online consent for joining up personal information, because I have no governance control, and I believe neither does government, and any government on this planet have the ability to do that governance of joining up personal information without my consent. And I think there's a debate to be had is, should we educate people to the extent that it has already escaped? Now, I'd understand exactly that if you could design it, you could contain it and separate it with encryption processes, but is that genie out of the bottle is part of, I think, the issue.
Stefan, is there anything you wanted to add before I move on to the next
Well,
question?
in Canada, I don't know what it's like, what data protection legislation is like exactly here in the UK, but I imagine there are commonalities. In Canada, for government, user consent is not the basis for collection of personal information. It's basically government services. They need to be authorized by law or program statute, or they need to have very there needs to be national security and lawful purposes. So user consent, if the user consents, they're still not allowed to collect it. The law needs to change, or there needs to be, and that's why we have, every territory has a data protection commissioner, and then we have a federal data protection commissioner, and whenever a new collection is made of personal information, whether that's an attribute or let alone a common identifier, where there was none before, such as, we would like to collect the social insurance number, as we call it in Canada, as well. So that needs to that's not just does the user consent. Thank God to me. And yes, in Canada there have been discussions about changing the law with what's called sharing zones, which has not been progressing well because it's a very delicate matter. So yes, so if you use technology, there's no conflict. You can share data across domains where there are no common identifiers with all the security that service providers want.
But you're right, from a data protection point of view, to differentiate when consent actually can work and when actually it doesn't work, and often there is a difference between the private sector and the public sector in those sorts of areas. There's a guy been waiting patiently there to ask his questions, so his patience shall be rewarded.
Fine. Well, my identity and role is Tim Marshall, Chief Executive of Adjunct UK, not Tim Marshall, Foreign News Editor of Sky Television, but sometimes Google gets me because I've got a broadcasting background as well. But to get on to the question, so David in his talk touched on a subject which I've also heard coming from the Cabinet Office, and namely from the CIO, which is about, as this area is explored, it's not a government-only initiative, but it very much combines with the private sector as well. As this is clearly a burden, let's put it that way, on the taxpayer, is the opportunity to work with the private sector also an opportunity to lessen the burden on the taxpayer of an identity management system, particularly in terms of the running costs?
Well, it could be, and naturally we have ambitions to share the cost. But that begs a lot of questions about how useful it can be to other people and whether they want to buy it. And as soon as you extend it to a private sector use, there are a whole set of other issues then about privacy, about priorities, about the conflicting priorities of the public and private sector. So possibly is the answer, but it can't just be decided on the basis that, thank goodness, somebody else is prepared to pay for it. There has to be a bit more to it than that, but possibly. And that's why we are having these conversations with some of the people who use identity so extensively in the private sector. And they increasingly need to develop their secure identifiers for their business. Clearly, there is a possibility of some collaboration, but it's all out there, but it's not yet decided. There is this serious work going on, which James Crosby is leading.
Okay, there's a guy at the back, yeah.
Yes, I'm speaking this evening in the spirit of George Orwell, who's turning everybody's grave and here, I think rather complacently. Throughout most of my life, I've wished I was younger, but now I'm glad I'm not going to be around. An awful feeling of fascist aura above all this place. And it isn't so much the government in this case, which is going to be all powerful and all embracing.
No.
It's the commercial interests who are going to hijack
Yeah.
these systems. The government can't run computer systems, that's well known and well understood, and they're going to make balls of it, which I think the level of discussion earlier has demonstrated there's not a deep understanding of a lot of the issues in this area. Excuse me if that sounds rather insulting, but I'm trying to do it briefly. So what time? What I'm most concerned about, I think, think, is the hijacking of these systems, as has been done with the Data Protection Act, which frankly is neither use nor ornament in terms of maintaining personal privacy. And these arguments that it's really for our own good, and that we're demanding these systems as part of a way of protecting ourselves. There's been hardly anyone purchasing insurance against identity theft, although it is now available. No one is demanding that they should have these systems in place in order to protect their identity. It's the government clearly imposing. And it's a bit more than that from the inferences that were made. It's actually the American government imposing, because they're insisting on these new passport rules. And if you look at the population of the world, 1% of the people voted for George Bush. So rather than there being a very broad, embracing agreement with this imposition of identity control, it's actually a very small, extremely arrogant at the moment, and rather scared population in the Midwest of America who are controlling these things. And frankly, we shouldn't let them get away with it.
Okay. Any observations or comments on that? Compassions?
So what are you going to do about it? Because this is the real world in which we live. And there are various things we could do. It's of course completely an option for the government to do nothing. That won't make it any better. I mean, it's no use saying we won't let the Americans get away with it. This is what they're doing, and therefore there are requirements on our citizens when they enter the US. But it's not just for that, is it? It is just possible that the government might be able to help the citizen to protect themselves. It's just possible, and it might be worth a try to do that. It's just possible that the government might be on the side of the citizen who is under threat in the way you describe. It's just possible that there's another point of view. It's just possible we might be very good at this and actually do it really well.
Right.
I know I'll never convince you of that.
Money laundering.
That's a debate for another day, that one.
In order to give you further material to read, if you haven't yet come across it, there's a report just been published by the Royal Academy of Engineering on the interaction between surveillance and identity management. Because clearly that's one of the areas that you've just expressed concern about. You expressed concern about lots of areas, but that was one of them I inferred. And indeed, in there, one of the issues that we raised, because I was a member of the working party that published that report, is that why should we look to government to provide the structures which make society safe? Because historically that hasn't always been the case. Indeed, it's been only for the last couple of 100 years that we've actually looked to a government to make society safe. Before that, society looked after itself to make it safe. And one of the benefits that comes from some of the technological things we talked about, given that it can be used and abused, is that you can also use it personally or in community groups to protect those communities from behaviour within the community that the community finds unacceptable. I'm deliberately being abstract in the words because, you know, if you say, well, it's just a legal imposition or it's a regulatory imposition or whatever, or it's fascism, it's a political imposition, that won't work. It's the community deciding what's acceptable for the community. So I think the fact that some of these technologies are now becoming available as surveillance technologies and control technologies for communities at a whole range of different scales, not just at the scale of a nation, but at much smaller scales, and there are visible signs of that, then that offers some possibilities to get away from the Orwellian situation that you describe you don't want to live with. I think the other thing I'd say, and Will may like to comment, because I believe there's already some survey work that shows that people who know how to use the internet and are younger than about 21, 22, give away their identity without even thinking about it. It's not an issue for them. The online presence is and the capability and society that delivers to them is much more valuable to them than their sense of surveillance or privacy. Now that may be an age thing as well. And I don't know, is that to tell me that's a wrong statement if I'm wrong, because I'd much rather know now than...
Well, I think most of the public give their privacy away.
Yeah, but I understood that young people are much more...
But yes, younger people are, well, computer users generally, and
Yeah.
internet users generally are less concerned over privacy than
Yeah.
on the internet than are
Yeah,
non-users.
that was what I heard.
Right, I think that's stuff away as well, that's the problem.
Well, and only their dad's money.
You had a separate question, Bill, before.
Well, maybe, because this panel really raised an issue that whatever your position is on privacy and surveillance and identity management, the complexity issue. That is, clearly, to move forward in any public policy, you have to clarify and simplify this so that people understand what is going on. And I'm just wondering if the complexity of this issue is such that it will be very difficult to explain the options and ways forward to a broad public. And if that's the case, are we just stymied in terms of making any decision versus whatever decision? How are we going to address the complexity that you've described, both of the last two speakers, Brian and Stefan?
I've been talking too much, you go.
Stefan.
Well, I can give you my perspective, having talked for 7 years with lots and lots of parties in Canada, government stakeholders in territories and federally. And it ties a bit into the previous question. I'm fairly optimistic. What we noticed is that, and it's not just in Canada, that in sort of until a couple of years ago, starting maybe in the late 90s, a lot of the government effort to get identity systems out there, even though it wasn't called identity management, were driven by, it's kind of ridiculous actually, but in the 80s and 90s, the national security organizations, CSE in Canada, NSA in the US, GCHQ here, and then we have Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, right? There's kind of a network. That's where all the security expertise really came from outside of industry, and they made heavy investments in money and resources and dedication to getting public key infrastructure technology out there for a variety of reasons, presumably because there was a thought of that it was the best thing, and so that never materialized. And I mean, I know all the founders of these PKI companies, so that dream never materialized. But as a result, a lot of parties who bought into it at the government level, who poured a lot of money into these efforts that didn't come to fruition, they got obviously kind of nervous about the implications of basically admitting that that was a path that wasn't as, big and meaningful for everybody as anticipated. So, and we've seen it in Canada that until a couple of years ago, a lot of people that in the government, they came from either the PKI companies or from Canadian security establishment. It's all back and forth, right? That's where traditionally the security expertise was. So it was basically a justification, hey, identity management, to try and get that same technology out there and say, see, and I mean, it's not just speculation. I mean, it's based on years of so many comments now from insiders that now this is falling apart because there's a new generation in government that's getting more in power positions who are not attached to old school security technologies that they need to justify in getting out there that are extremely privacy invasive because they were not designed to do these things. And in my case, I can actually say that because my thesis supervisors were Ron Rivas and Adi Shamir, who are the inventors of PKI. So now this sort of young blood, which is turning in their early 40s, they're way more open. They notice 5 years of efforts to push government online, to do national identity cards have led to nothing. So we need to rethink things, right? And so the restructuring is going on everywhere. Governments are being restructured. New blood rises to more authoritative levels, and they do want the debate because they don't, right? So it's happening. And this is actually, a small sign of it, I guess, but it's happening everywhere. So I'm very optimistic. But yes, it takes a lot of explanation, right? But ultimately, PKI is equally difficult to explain, right? There's no public key infrastructure technology. It's the same. That shouldn't matter. What matters is it possible to do these things? And then you ask the experts, if you want to, you ask lots and lots of them. If they all say yes, that's how we built spacecrafts and so forth, right? It's It's not that that policymakers need to understand the technicalities of it. They need to be able to validate that it works as claimed. So I'm optimistic.
I like optimism. I'm going to go to this guy now who's been waiting. I'm going to come to you.
Rob Bernison from the Cybersecurity Knowledge Transfer Network. I'm very interested in the knowledge transfer problem that Stefan alluded to. I mean, when I first got into security, I skimmed Bruce Schneier's book by cryptography, as probably most people have. If you haven't, I recommend it. I know Bruce Schneier doesn't need publicity, but I recommend it. And I saw some of these cryptographic protocols, thought, wow, you can do that with cryptography, wow, you can do that with cryptography. And now I see that there's still this gap between the capability of those multi-party protocols and this great need to get them implemented. So I've got some thoughts on how we might bridge that gap.
People don't experience that. They experience the services that are derived from it, and they build up trust in those services because they never break. They never go wrong. They deliver what they expect and nothing but what they expect. And I think there are those services out there. They're embedded in lots of things already. So I think you don't need to elaborate on that at the level of what the technology is about. You need to interpret it in the form of, this is the quality of service that you will get as a result of using this toolkit. The technologists, of course, need to understand all that, and they need to know how to join it all up and manage it robustly and make sure we've got the right cadre of people coming out of universities who can manage this sophisticated infrastructure that we're putting underneath the bonnet. I mean, working in transport, you can imagine how I feel about sophisticated infrastructure that we've had for 200 years. And, you know, we still know how to run railways, don't we? So, you know, that's the issue. And I mean, it's a serious issue. I'm not really joking about transport. We seriously still need to educate people in how to run sophisticated infrastructures. And the sophisticated part of the infrastructure that is going in this part of our online environment, it's not the only part, is to do with cryptography. So we certainly need to do that. And I know that the government, this government, is funding my university, it's about to when it signs the cheque, to develop a master's degree in exactly that space for government. There is already, and some of you will know all too well, already degrees in this country in that space which are more general, but there's one very specifically being aimed at making sure government has enough cadre, a big enough cadre of professionals who understand how to do information assurance and everything that lies underneath it for government purposes, which I think is particularly important.
Okay. We'll move on to another question. Go at the back onto the camera.
Ian Brown from University College London. I think I share Stefan's frustration that the debate hasn't moved on a great deal in the 15 years that I've been following it either. I think one way that could be improved is if people spoke more plainly and were more aware of the technological possibilities and the evidence for assertions they're making. For example, I think the whole the whole idea of identity management misses the point. Usually people aren't wanting to prove their identities, they're wanting to prove, as Brian said, a role, or that they're authorised to do something, or they have a certain attribute that needs to be linked to a permanent assigned at birth identity. We hear from the government claims about the losses Britain's incurring due to identity theft, the billions, which even the banks attack. That includes a large component of fraud against financial institutions. APAX, the Bank Association, came out and made those claims and said that is not the case. Claims that international conventions require fingerprints and other biometrics in passports. They don't. The International Civil Aviation Authority rules say that you need digital photos on a chip. They go no further than that. The Schengen requirements are talking about fingerprints, but of course the UK isn't a member of the Schengen Group. On Facebook, you hear every meeting you go to concerning privacy these days, the younger generation don't care about privacy, you just look at what they do on Facebook and MySpace and all of these social networking sites. Some of them, of course, do change their opinion when they start applying for jobs. And employers are surfing through the pictures and drunk on the university campuses.
It's because their employers are an older generation.
Finally, thinking about how to get these technologies deployed, I think that perhaps the government has been ambitious and rushed ahead in trying to launch this all-encompassing scheme when there are interesting innovations going on in the private sector. Microsoft's card space, which is being built into Windows, I think could be the biggest thing that could hit this area because it will be on everyone's desktops in a year or two. And if they are combining that with things like Stefan's technology, I think then this might move ahead.
Any comments on that from the
No.
Any other questions? Yes, okay.
Sorry. As I understand it, the model that you're developing in the Irish identity card is it will produce a very high assurance degree of identity, which then can be shared and used by accredited organisations. And to an extent, the private sector, commercial sector, perhaps uses or has a risk model which is different from what you use yours for. And they have had some lessons in their use of sharing identity management over some years. What lessons do you think you have learned, or government is learning, borrowing from the private sector, that as it develops its identity management system? I've heard about user-centric systems and developing things incrementally. What else do you think the government has learned during this process?
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. My colleague in the room can talk a bit more about the details of that. Do you want to say something about it?
I'm not sure I know the answer to it either. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the private sector, and as Sir David's mentioned, Crosby's Forum on Public-Private Identity Management is looking at some of these issues now. I think it'd be invidious of me to speculate about what he's going to say in his report before it's published. But I mean, some of the things that have been mentioned tonight are certainly very alive in the debate. PKR, for instance, the processes and risk-based assessments. There are a lot of things around which are known, which are taken account of in particular situations, but I don't think there's a list which I could give you now of lessons to be learned from the private sector. Sorry if that sounds unhelpful.
Okay. Do you want to ask your question, Elliot?
Hi, Ian Henderson. My interest is in building what we call professional-grade information management systems for individuals. So I have a view that in 10 years' time, the dominant supplier of information to government and to the private sector will be the individual themselves.
Yeah.
If all that's missing is the tools and the processes to enable that, and some changes in legislation that will help that along. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts on that?
I would tend to agree. I mean, the way the technology is going will allow you to walk around with a thing you could hang around your neck that will contain enough storage to take all your audio, all your video, all your biosensor data for about 10 years and continually have it hanging around your neck. So you can contain everything about your life experience. So when you want to share elements of that with anyone else, which contain elements of you, that's why I keep coming back to this piece about consent, in that domain, that you want to have the switches that allow partitioned information out of that record to be shared with whoever is appropriate for whatever purpose you mutually agree is acceptable. And so it comes back to information sharing again. And I think the generalization of what we mean by personal information is going to be another aspect of the growth of what you allude to, because so much more of our digital footprint, so much more of our life experience will be stored as a digital footprint than it historically has, that it will become one of the more dominant things we need to worry about. So I think we have to look at what do we mean by personal information in a more abstract way than we have done over the last 15 years.
So just to build on that, then, does that imply that government systems, for example, would take that, would be built on that kind of basis?
Are you saying should they be, or are they going to? It's in another forum. So David and I were talking about future-proofing investment in government capability to handle data of one sort or another. And I think not just government, actually any organisation has got to understand the rapid rate of growth of the underlying technology, and I think more importantly in the application and analysis space of information, that is going to be transformed in the next 15 years. So not only is the quality and quantity of data going to be huge, way beyond our conception now, the ability to mine is a sort of metaphor that people think, oh, that's like mining. It isn't. It's a much more complicated set of processes that you could use to analyze and synthesize information and knowledge out of that set of data. That is going to become much more sophisticated as well. So, gentleman at the back who said words about commercial exploitation, it comes back to governance of the exploitation for me. And if it's my data and it's about me, then I want control over the governance. And I think those are one of the things that sort of go straight into the human rights piece, as it's one of those, that's where it connects for me with the sort of fundamental principle of me as a biological organism. And then identity becomes only one of the parts of all of this. So I may be a bit futuristic and a bit abstract. I'm sorry if that does sound like that, but it seems to me that's the space we're going into. You've only got to look back, 15 years from now and say, what did we do with the World Wide Web 15 years ago? We didn't have the World Wide Web 15 years ago. And look how that has transformed what we're doing. Now, the World Wide Web is the first generation. It's the Model T Ford of what we're going to do with the connectivity that we've got around the world. In 15 years' time, we're going to have a Lamborghini. And that's going to be a really different animal to, sorry, it's not a good metaphor, different vehicle to exploit that network, in my view.
Well, it is the dilemma of all big investments, whether they're by government or by someone else, isn't it? About whether it will be out of date before you've got halfway through it. And of course, a 10-year programme is a very long-term programme, and it'll certainly look different at the end from when you started. And that is a major challenge, but it is no different from the challenge that government and others face when they're making those big long-term investments. And something I just want to say, which is the government is not building a database in which it is going to collect all your personal information to which lots of people will have access. I mean, that, I know I hope it's obvious that isn't the model. If it were, you'd be right to be absolutely appalled by it. That is not what is happening. It is actually doing something very much more limited and collecting some biometric data and some basic biographical information and holding it. What that then, both what it allows people to do with it and also what access it provides to others is both to be regulated, and also there are a series of choices there. And there is no possibility, in my view, of going very far down this road without very strict regulation of what can and cannot be done. Some of that is there already, and who has access to it. And you can have that assurance about a government scheme because it will be very public, it will be very publicly audited, it will be reported on. People like them will be checking it every single step of the way and regulating it. So will the Information Commissioner. You probably can't say that about a lot of other people in this world, can you? So I understand the worries about George Orwell. I'm not sure that gentleman's still here. But I can't see him now. Yes, he is. I understand that, and I don't expect you to be confident in the state. You're right to be sceptical always about the state's authority and power, but at least we are very heavily regulated, and we operate to very strict laws which go through Parliament. We can't even make the scheme compulsory, although I think the government would have liked to have done, without going back to Parliament, and that will be, as you quite appreciate, be a very big debate. So there are some very, very considerable limitations on what the government in its national identity scheme is going to do. But I understand, and you should understand, it is just one part of the forest here, isn't it? And it's the government's solution for the moment. It is not about a lot of other things. A lot of other things will continue and continue to develop. All the debates about what the uses and challenges of identity are will continue alongside it.
So I have a different perspective, though, on that question. So what I think currently there is the way government is trying to move forward with identity schemes is very monolithic, which in fact since 5 years even industry is letting go of from experience in the enterprise identity world as they try to cross boundaries. That's why we have come up with web services. That's why there are standards now or de facto standards like WS Trust and so forth, which are all based on the notion of that you cannot define an identity system that's going to be used on a large scale in a monolithic way. You can only, and the analogy is payment systems. If you look at payment systems, right, that there's a very clear analogy to identity management systems. In identity management systems, it's all about personal information that flows from some point here to some point there. If you look at what's called SAML, they actually define it as such. where what is that data? It can be an authentication statement, an authorization statement, or an attribute statement. That's how it's called. So they're all personal data. That's what identity management is all about. How do we get the data from here to here across organizational domains now? So with payments, you do similar. There are statements that are made by one party that have to go elsewhere. They're just of a very strict financial nature, and so if you look at how many payment systems are there, right? Today, there are literally many, many dozens. So debit, credit cards, automated clearinghouse payments, cash, and then there's a whole range, checks, then there are money orders and traveler's checks, and there's a whole range of them that have very esoteric properties. So, and they all try to accomplish one thing, which is to move money from one point to another. Now, why do all these different approaches exist, right? Notice that some are directly in the backend, some flow through users, some flow through intermediators. And so that has to do with each participant's needs with regard to availability, scalability, security, liability, accountability, privacy. And for identity management, it's exactly the same. And so we won't have a user-centric world 10, 15 years from now, and we won't have a back-end-centric, organization-centric world. Both are valid. It's the important part is when you move to electronic payment systems, that at the nodes, which is where the participants reside, you need to have policy engines that decide on the basis of the various needs of the interacting parties, how the data should flow, what is appropriate, and that ties into policy discussions. That is not a technology discussion. So the technology discussion should on the technology side, what government should do is make sure these systems are designed so that they will not interfere with policy discussions, that they won't contravene privacy and security and whatever other requirements that parties will have in different application settings, including individuals themselves. And right now, the two are blurred because technology,
5 years now, and I've managed a fair number of software development projects. And good practice in project management is to have a clear idea of what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. Could the panel comment on the government's approach to the ID cards project, which seems to be, this is an ID card, this is the solution, now let's have a look for the problem.
No, you can't.
I'm putting into the panel.
There was, if you remember, one of the things I said towards the end was having clarity of objectives, and I too have been where you've been, and indeed I've been on the other end in terms of writing the damn thing, in terms of the code. And if you don't have a clear idea of what this is supposed to do, you'll turn out with a complete dog's breakfast of software, and it won't do anything useful. So drilling into that level, yes, you need to assemble your identity management system out of components, and this is actually picking up what Stefan just said. It's picking up components which are well written and well articulated to provide sub-components of the services you want to deliver, and assemble them in such a way that you will deliver the services you want. Now, one of the arguments against lack of clarity of service delivery objectives is well, we don't really know what society is going to look like or what it's going to tolerate. So what are going to be the principal kernel pieces of our service capability that we could build so that you can assemble the service you want in a trusted way, using all the protocols you just described, and no problem with that. That's fine. So in a sense, as long as you start on a road of saying we're going to need this family of things, which are going to be generic, and we'll use them in such a way that you can deliver a whole range of different services, you can start down the road of developing some of the pieces without knowing what the final picture is going to be. But I agree with you, it's a risky strategy, and you have to start crystallizing what the objectives are. Now, I thought I heard Sir David say towards the end of his talk exactly what the identity card scheme had as its objectives. Now, I agree, 4 years ago, and indeed when I was acting for the Home Affairs Committee, questions were asked about what is this scheme for? And I believe in the last 2 or 3 years, that set of objectives has crystallized considerably. Now, you may argue, has it crystallized enough for a hard-nosed software engineer to say, I couldn't sit down and write the software that would deliver that service? I think that gap is being closed. That's part of what the programme objectives are at the moment. And I think that's about as far as I want to go.
So David, did you want to add anything?
Well, I did try. I mean, they are set out here. Let me just backtrack. There's been a debate about whether the government should introduce a national identity scheme since 2002. So there has been a debate for about 5 years. And it is true that in that debate there have been multiple objectives. But actually the government has narrowed down those objectives. And I said it starts with security and public protection, protection against illegal immigration, against crime and terrorism. And then I listed some other things. I did list 4 things. Now, what is also happening is that alongside that, there is a growing debate about, well, if we're going to have this, it could meet other objectives as well. And you're quite right that if we're not careful, we will try to do too many things with it. We will try to develop citizen-centric services, to beat illegal immigration, to tackle terrorism. We'll try to do too much. We are clear that we're designing a scheme that is focused on what I said about, and is described here, about security and public protection. That's where we start. If, having done that, we can develop an identifier which can be used for other purposes, then that is all to the good, but we are very cautious about adding those objectives too quickly. And anyway, we won't have the mass, the critical mass in the scheme quickly to achieve all those objectives, and we will have to focus them down anyway. But it is quite clearly described here. You may disagree with them, which is fine, but I don't think it's true that we haven't defined the objectives. I think it's true that the debate is going in all directions, and that's fine.
Did you have a quick comment?
Well, a quick comment. You laid quite a lot of emphasis on the Barney report, and you raised the illustration of somebody having to contact the government 44 times. Now, apart from the fact that a much cheaper solution would be to sack the manager of the department concerned, it does strike me that using that argument of an extreme case in support of ID cards, you may as well use the argument terrorist outrage in the United Kingdom, the 7/7 bombings.
I didn't say that.
Is an argument in favour of why bother?
Okay,
You'll be able to look on the webcast to see what I actually said. I said that the government's argument for ID cards starts with security and public protection, and I defined that very clearly. I then, in about 3 or 4 paragraphs, said, in parallel, David Varney has been looking at how we should transform public services. And actually his report, which is here, is about lots of things. He says having a secure identifier would help that. And actually, therefore, we should put our weight behind the development of the national identity scheme because it could enable citizen-centric services. But the government is starting with security and public protection. If we then can develop the scheme that we're talking about, it should be possible to use it for other purposes. But you're entirely right that if we have too many objectives, we'll achieve none of them.
We'll have a tail discussion on that because that's a seminar in its own right. I know because I've spoken at them.
But I would like to add that I think it's undeniable that still today that a lot of these debates in all the countries that are trying to push for identity management infrastructures are dominated on the security side by national security agencies. I mean, so whether that's a past justification again or simply not wanting to lose power over what always used to be their domain, right? And it never went out of there. That was what they were doing. It's not exactly clear, but it has to do a lot with that. And so there are unspecified requirements of these systems that are never sort of put out there like this is really what we want. And so which also I don't think so that's that's not going to help getting the systems out there because ultimately if people don't accept it, it's going to be a failure, and it has happened in the past, right? So anyway, what can I say? You know, we've as an example, colleagues of mine in the space. In Canada and in fact here in the UK, we've tried to talk with the emerging technologies people 4 or 5 years ago already with the e-envoy, we've tried to talk with GCHQ, and just briefing sessions. It's go away, right? And they dominate everything security. Same in Canada, and it's not. It's other. I mean, if you go to the history tracing back to 47, right? The whole. I understand why that is, right? It tends to be the younger people there. They're interested in all these newer technologies, but the vested interests are kind of like, no, we have our own thinking of how to do this. We've certified systems of parties that we like and maybe have invested in, like Entrust in Canada, let's say, right? People of ours work there. They have vested interests in using that technology. So, I mean, I can say this easily because I'm not a UK citizen, so I guess no funding of mine will be cut anywhere. So, but this is certainly, I mean, it's a dominant factor. I'm not saying there's bad will there. It's just kind of a normal human defensive nature. When your job has always been to do certain things, and you think you're the king of the, everybody relies on you to do a good job of that, and certainly, what you did is not getting out there. You have to justify why all the resources that were being spent did not deliver, and then you're on top of that, you're starting to lose your dominance in expertise in the field. So that's extremely threatening, right? So as I look in Canada, when it comes to security, who has been designing government online systems in Canada for treasury boards? It's the Canadian security establishment people. They move to positions, architecture positions, in Treasury Board, where they do the technical work, right? And so yes, PKI, this is how it works. So.
Okay. Now I've got my own clock. Is your question a really quick question?
I want to know about the considerations for what sort of potential control citizens' identity card holders could have over their own attribute data release if it was going to be used for those sorts of purposes. I want the idea of everybody carrying around their personal data on a device around their neck. I do some of that, but I could be a bad person, and of course I could have made that data up. It could be about somebody else. So I think the model that people are going to arrive at is that they will trust an identity provider who's a bit too big to get away. And that might even be an organisation like a government, it might be a university, it might be a local council or something. And so the National Identity Scheme is a candidate for being that kind of trusted identity provider, but only if the users have got some level of control over saying, yes, you can tell this organisation that I want to do business with about me, but this one's harassing me and trying to control.
That is the model, and indeed, being able to use the information without consent is very heavily regulated indeed. That's right. By the law. I mean, it's rather like actually.
But consent that is not enough.
But
Because
how do people exercise that control? Nobody, ordinary people, as our people said, don't really understand or don't care about personal data privacy, and younger ones don't, even less than older ones. They certainly don't understand the whole concepts around attribute release policy.
Well, if you want us to go into this, I'm always suspicious of arguments which say people don't understand. To some extent, if we are very transparent about what is and is not allowed, there will be a certain degree of regulation of this. I actually do believe that people make their choices about how much data they are prepared to have released or not, and actually do care about this, and actually do more about it. And young people make their choices. Young people have always been willing to take more risks than others, and that will continue, and so on. So we
will go on forever if I don't draw it to a close, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. Okay, well. Can I first of all thank all of you who have contributed from the floor. I am sorry that there's not been as much time as perhaps we'd like for that, but we have gone on for a lot longer to provide you with opportunity for that. I'd like to thank Bill and the Oxford Internet Institute for facilitating all this, and I really do appreciate it, and I hope all of you do. And also to thank the speakers who, if my goal at the start of the day was to learn more, to have debate stimulated, fostered, then I think they've achieved the goal for me. So I thank them on behalf of you. I think we show appreciation in the normal way.